The morning I signed our divorce papers, I thought I was finally free. 3 years of marriage therapy, countless arguments about his increasingly erratic behavior, and endless nights wondering where the Ryan I'd fallen in love with had disappeared to. The lawyer's office smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams as I watched Ryan scrawl his signature with hands that trembled slightly. He wouldn't meet my eyes. When it was done, I walked out of that building, believing I was closing the door on the most confusing chapter of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had no idea I was about to walk straight into a nightmare that would make our failed marriage look like a fairy tale. 2 weeks later, driving through Cedar Falls to collect the last of my belongings from our shared storage unit, I turned down Maple Street toward my childhood home. Mom had been asking me to visit more often since the divorce, claiming she worried about me living alone in Portland. The familiar Victorian house came into view with its wraparound porch and the ancient oak tree I'd climbed as a child. But parked in the driveway, right next to my mother's silver Honda, sat Ryan's distinctive black pickup truck. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The same truck he'd claimed was being repossessed due to financial troubles. The same vehicle he'd tearfully told me we couldn't afford to keep, forcing me to take on extra freelance writing projects to help with his mounting debts. Yet there it was, gleaming as if it had just been detailed, sitting in my mother's driveway like it belonged there. I parked across the street, my mind racing. Maybe he was asking Mom for money. Maybe he was trying to get her to convince me to take him back. But something about the casual way the truck sat there, as if it had been there many times before, sent ice through my veins. The front door was closed, curtains drawn. I approached the house where I'd spent 18 years of my life, now feeling like a stranger. Instead of knocking, some instinct made me walk around to the back garden, where the kitchen window had always been slightly warped, never quite closing properly. Mom had complained about the draft for years but never fixed it. I crept closer, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure the neighbors could hear it. Dr. Vance. I knew that name. Helena Vance had been Ryan's therapist for the past 4 years, starting just after we'd married. She'd been recommended by his family as someone who specialized in helping young men adjust to marriage and adult responsibilities. I'd thought it was slightly old-fashioned, but Ryan had insisted he needed the support. I'd even met with Dr. Vance myself a few times when Ryan's behavior became more erratic. She'd been sympathetic, professional, suggesting that some men simply struggled with the transition to married life. She'd recommended patience, understanding, and had prescribed a mild anti-anxiety medication for Ryan that seemed to make him more compliant, but also more distant. Now I understood why. My mother's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. What about Natalie's trust fund? She still doesn't know about Charles's real estate investments? Trust fund. My father had a trust fund? The man who'd clipped coupons and made us turn off lights to save electricity had secret real estate investments? The woman I now knew was Dr. Vance consulted a tablet. The Cedar Falls properties alone are worth $8 million. The Portland commercial buildings add another one, $5 million. With Ryan legally separated from Natalie's assets through divorce, and Natalie unaware of her inheritance, the funds can be transferred to the foundation without her interference. Foundation. What foundation? Ryan spoke again, his voice still carrying that horrible mechanical quality. How long do I maintain the financial distress narrative? Until the trust funds are fully transferred. Another 6 weeks at most. Then you can begin the reconciliation phase. Natalie's psychology profile suggests she'll be receptive to your apparent recovery once she believes you've overcome your personal struggles. My stomach lurched. They were planning for Ryan to come back, to convince me that whatever had been wrong with him was now fixed. Right around the time they finished stealing money I didn't even know existed. Dr. Vance leaned back in her chair, satisfaction evident in her posture. Carol, you've played your role perfectly. The concerned mother worried about her daughter's failing marriage, subtly encouraging the divorce while maintaining complete deniability. My mother actually smiled. The woman who had held me while I cried about Ryan's increasingly strange behavior, who had agreed that divorce might be the best option, who had offered to let me move back home if I needed space to heal. She'd been manipulating me the entire time. It wasn't difficult, Mom said, her voice carrying a casual cruelty I'd never heard before. Natalie's always been trusting. Too trusting. Just like her father. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Just like her father. Had they done something to Dad too? Before I could process that terrifying thought further, Dr. Vance stood up. I need to return to Portland. Ryan, your next session is Thursday at 2. We'll work on strengthening the recovery narrative protocols. Ryan nodded, still staring straight ahead. Understood. As Dr. Vance gathered her files, she paused. Carol, ensure that Natalie doesn't develop any suspicion about Ryan's improved circumstances. If she starts asking questions about his finances or his behavior changes, contact me immediately. Of course. Though honestly, I don't think we need to worry. She's so focused on her writing career and her new apartment, she barely asks about family matters anymore. They were right. I had been focused on rebuilding my life, on my freelance writing business that was finally gaining traction, on the small but sunny apartment in Portland that felt like the first space that was truly mine in years. I'd been so grateful to escape the confusion and heartache of my marriage that I hadn't looked back. I should have looked back. Dr. Vance moved toward the front door, and I realized I needed to get back to my car before anyone spotted me. But as I started to move away from the window, I heard my mother's voice one more time. Helena, what happens if Natalie finds out about any of this? The pause that followed felt endless. She won't. But if she does... Dr. Vance's voice dropped to something barely audible. We have contingencies, the same ones we used with Charles when he started asking too many questions about his own investments. My father. They were talking about my father, the man who died suddenly of a heart attack at 58, healthy one day and gone the next. The man who'd been asking questions about his investments. I backed away from the window on unsteady legs, my mind reeling. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a simple financial scam. They had been manipulating Ryan for years, had orchestrated our entire marriage and divorce, and somehow my own mother was at the center of it all. And if I was right about the implication in Dr. Vance's words, they might have killed my father. I made it back to my car without being seen, but I sat there for several minutes, trying to process what I'd overheard. The Ryan I'd married, the man I'd fallen in love with, had been artificially created through some kind of psychological conditioning. The behavioral problems that had destroyed our marriage weren't mental health issues or personal struggles. They were the result of deliberate manipulation designed to keep him compliant, while they orchestrated a complex financial fraud. And my mother, the woman who had raised me, who had taught me to value honesty and kindness, was helping them steal millions of dollars that apparently belonged to me. The sound of the front door opening made me start the engine quickly. I drove away as casually as I could manage, but my hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over 3 blocks away. I sat in a parking lot behind the Cedar Falls library, staring at my phone. Who could I call? Who could I trust? My mother was obviously compromised. Ryan wasn't really Ryan anymore, if Dr. Vance's conditioning was as complete as it appeared. I didn't even know if the friends we'd shared during our marriage were genuine relationships or part of the elaborate deception. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely alone. But I wasn't helpless. I was a freelance investigative journalist. I knew how to research, how to find information, how to verify facts. If they thought I was too trusting, too focused on my own life to notice what they were doing, they were about to learn how wrong they were. I opened the Notes app on my phone and began typing everything I'd overheard, every detail I could remember. Names, dates, specific phrases. Dr. Helena Vance. The conditioning program. The trust fund worth over $4 million. The foundation they were transferring money to. The timeline of 6 weeks. And most importantly, the suggestion that my father's death hadn't been natural. As I typed, my shock began crystallizing into something sharper and more focused. They had stolen years of my life. They had turned my husband into a puppet, and my mother into a co-conspirator. They had destroyed my marriage as part of a calculated plan to steal money I didn't even know existed. And if they had killed my father, they had taken the most important person in my world. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. But I was also smart enough to know that confronting them directly would be suicide. If they were willing to kill my father for asking questions, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate me if they discovered I knew the truth. I needed to be strategic, careful, and above all, I needed evidence. Real evidence that would stand up in court and couldn't be dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of a recently divorced woman. I drove back to Portland that afternoon, but instead of going to my apartment, I went to the downtown library. If I was going to take down a conspiracy that had been years in the making, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The first thing I researched was Dr. Helena Vance. Her website showed an impressive credentials list: PhD in behavioral psychology from Stanford, specialization in cognitive behavioral modification, 15 years of practice in Portland and Cedar Falls. Her client testimonials were glowing, particularly from families dealing with what she termed adjustment disorders in young adults.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But when I dug deeper, using the databases I had access to through my journalism credentials, I found something interesting. Dr. Vance had been involved in several research projects that had been quietly shut down by ethics committees. Studies involving behavioral modification techniques that pushed the boundaries of informed consent. There were no formal sanctions on her record, but there was a pattern of research that had been deemed ethically questionable by peer review boards. Most troubling was a study from 8 years ago titled Long-Term Compliance Conditioning in Adult Subjects. The abstract was heavily redacted, but the few available details described techniques for creating lasting behavioral changes through a combination of medication, environmental control, and what was euphemistically called reinforcement protocols. The study had been terminated early, but not before Dr. Vance had published papers on maintaining induced behavioral patterns in naturalistic settings. Reading between the lines, it seemed like she had developed methods for conditioning people to behave in specific ways. It was exactly what I'd witnessed with Ryan. Next, I researched my father's death. The official cause was sudden cardiac arrest, not unusual for a man his age. But when I requested copies of his medical records, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. In the 6 months before his death, Dad had made several appointments with doctors in Portland. Specialists he'd never mentioned to Mom or me. Cardiologists, neurologists, toxicologists. He'd been getting second opinions about symptoms that weren't in his regular medical file with our family doctor in Cedar Falls. The last appointment, just 2 weeks before he died, was with a toxicologist who specialized in detecting unusual substances in blood work. Dad had paid for that consultation in cash, which was completely unlike him. He'd always been meticulous about insurance claims and medical documentation. Someone had been slowly poisoning my father, and he'd figured it out just before he died. But the most chilling discovery came when I researched the real estate investments Mom had mentioned. Using Dad's social security number and the public records databases, I found a portfolio of properties worth exactly what Dr. Vance had stated: $3 million. Properties that had been purchased over a 15-year period, all in Dad's name, all financed through a series of shell companies that traced back to something called the Cedar Falls Community Foundation. The same foundation Dr. Vance had mentioned as the destination for the transferred funds. My father hadn't been investing in real estate as a side business. He'd been used as a front for money laundering, exactly the way they were now planning to use me through the trust fund I'd never known about. But here's what they hadn't counted on. Dad had been keeping records. Hidden in the property filings, disguised as routine maintenance documentation, were notes in his handwriting. Questions about property valuations that didn't match market rates. Concerns about renovation work that was billed but never performed. Records of meetings with people whose names didn't match the supposed contractors and property managers. My father had been investigating his own investment portfolio, and he'd discovered the same fraud they were now trying to perpetrate with my inheritance. As I sat in the library, surrounded by printed documents and online research, I began to see the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just about stealing money from me. It was an ongoing operation that had been running for at least 15 years, using local families as unwitting fronts for financial crimes. Dr. Vance wasn't just a therapist who'd gone rogue. She was running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used psychological conditioning to control key individuals while siphoning money through fake foundations and shell companies. And my mother wasn't just a co-conspirator. Based on the timeline of my father's property investments, she'd been involved from the very beginning. The woman who had raised me, who had taught me right from wrong, had been running cons on her own family for my entire adult life. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that divorcing me from Ryan would eliminate any risk of discovery. They thought that by giving me what I wanted, freedom from a confusing and painful marriage, they could proceed with their financial crimes without interference. They didn't realize that divorce had freed me from more than just Ryan's conditioned behavior. It had freed me from the entire web of manipulation and control they'd spent years weaving around my life. And now I was going to use that freedom to destroy them. But first, I needed to understand exactly how extensive this operation was, who else was involved, and most importantly, I needed to find a way to help Ryan. Whatever they'd done to him, however complete their conditioning might be, he was as much a victim as I was. The man I'd married, the real Ryan underneath all that programming, deserved a chance to be free. Even if I wasn't sure I could ever forgive him for what his conditioned self had put me through. I closed my laptop as the library prepared to close, my mind already planning the next phase of my investigation. Tomorrow, I would start building the case that would bring down Dr. Helena Vance and everyone involved in her operation. Tonight, I would go home to my small apartment and grieve for the father I'd lost, the mother I'd never really known, and the husband who'd never really been mine. But tomorrow, I would begin to fight back. The next morning, I called in sick to my freelance assignments and drove back to Cedar Falls. But this time, I wasn't going to my mother's house. I was going to the Cedar Falls Public Records Office, a squat brick building downtown, where I'd spent countless hours as a teenager researching local history for school projects. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly clerk who'd helped me with those long-ago assignments, was still behind the counter. "Natalie Brooks! I heard about your divorce, honey. I'm so sorry it didn't work out." Her sympathy felt genuine, which made it harder to smile and accept her condolences, knowing what I now suspected about my entire life. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Actually, I'm here on a research project. I'm writing an article about family businesses in Cedar Falls, how they've evolved over the decades. I was hoping to look at some property records, business licenses, that sort of thing." Her face lit up. "Oh, how wonderful! Cedar Falls has such rich business history. What families are you focusing on?" "The Torres family, for starters. They've been in construction for generations, right?" I kept my voice casual, professional. "Oh yes, though there have been some changes in recent years. Let me pull those files for you." While she gathered the Torres construction records, I asked casually, "What about the Cedar Falls Community Foundation? I've heard they do good work in the area." Mrs. Patterson paused, a slight frown crossing her features. "Well, they certainly handle a lot of money, though I have to say, for a community foundation, they don't seem to fund many local projects. Most of their grants go to organizations in Portland, Oregon, Seattle." Interesting. A community foundation that didn't actually benefit the community. She brought me boxes of files, and I settled into a corner table to begin what would become the most important research of my life. The Torres construction records painted a picture that made my stomach turn. The family business had been thriving for decades until about 5 years ago, when the financial records showed a dramatic shift. Suddenly, instead of taking on diverse construction projects throughout Oregon, Torres Construction began focusing almost exclusively on renovation work for properties owned by the Cedar Falls Community Foundation. Properties that, according to the invoices, required constant and expensive maintenance. A warehouse that needed new electrical systems every 6 months. A series of residential properties that underwent kitchen renovations annually. Commercial buildings that somehow required structural work multiple times per year. The billing was astronomical, and all of it was paid promptly by the foundation. But here's what made my hands shake as I read through the files. Ryan's signature was on every single invoice. His handwriting, his name, all documenting work that was either unnecessary or, in many cases, completely fabricated. I recognized some of the addresses from my father's hidden property portfolio. My ex-husband hadn't just been conditioned to be compliant in our marriage. He'd been turned into the front man for a massive construction fraud scheme, signing off on millions of dollars in fake renovation work. And given the timing, this had all started right around the time we'd gotten married. I photographed every document I could, my hands trembling as I realized the scope of what I was uncovering. This wasn't just about my inheritance, or even my father's death. This was about a criminal enterprise that had been systematically draining money from the community for years, using psychological conditioning to create perfect, unquestioning accomplices. Mrs. Patterson returned with more files. I found the foundation records you asked about, though I have to warn you, they're quite extensive. Dr. Vance has been very thorough with her documentation. Dr. Vance? Of course she was directly involved with the foundation. Dr. Vance runs the foundation? She's the executive director, has been for about 8 years now. Very professional woman, though I always thought it was unusual for a psychologist to branch out into community development. Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice conspiratorially. Between you and me, some of the older residents have wondered why so much foundation money goes to Portland projects instead of local needs. But Dr. Vance always has very reasonable explanations. I'll bet she does. The foundation records were even more damning than the construction files. For 8 years, the Cedar Falls Community Foundation had been receiving massive donations from a network of what appeared to be local families. The Brooks Family Trust, established in my father's name, had donated over $2 million. The Torres Family Trust had contributed another one, $8 million. The Patterson Trust, the Williams Trust, the Chen Trust, dozens of local families had apparently been incredibly generous to their community. Except I was willing to bet that most of these families had no idea they were making these donations. I found records for 12 different family trusts, all managed by the same Portland law firm, all making regular substantial donations to Dr. Vance's foundation. And every single one of these families had at least one member who had been or was currently seeing Dr. Vance for therapy. The pattern was clear. Dr. Vance would identify families with significant assets, begin treating someone in the family for behavioral issues, gradually gain control over their finances through psychological manipulation, and then systematically drain their wealth through her fake foundation. My father had been just one victim in a years-long operation that had stolen millions from Cedar Falls families. But as I dug deeper into the foundation's grant records, I discovered something that made me physically ill. The foundation wasn't just stealing money. It was laundering it through fake charitable programs before funneling it to offshore accounts. A youth mentorship program that existed only on paper. Educational scholarships awarded to students who didn't exist. Community development projects in Portland that had never been built. Every single grant was documented with professional-looking reports and photographs, but none of it was real. Dr. Vance hadn't just created a way to steal money. She'd created an entire fake charity infrastructure to hide where the money was really going. I was so absorbed in the records that I didn't notice Mrs. Patterson approaching until she cleared her throat. Natalie, dear, I hate to interrupt, but we're closing in a few minutes. Did you find what you needed for your article? I looked up, realizing hours had passed. Yes, thank you so much. This has been incredibly helpful. As I gathered my things, she leaned closer. You know, since you're researching local businesses, you might want to talk to Tom Chen. His family's been in Cedar Falls for generations, and he's had some interesting observations about recent changes in the community. Tom Chen. I'd seen his family trust in the foundation records. That's a great idea. Do you know how I can reach him? He runs the hardware store on Main Street. But Natalie. She hesitated, glancing around to make sure we were alone. Tom's been asking a lot of questions lately about financial matters. Family finances, specifically. He seemed quite worried. If you do talk to him, maybe you could mention that there are resources available if families are having troubles. Sometimes people are too proud to ask for help. The way she said it made me think Tom Chen might be discovering the same things I was. Maybe I wasn't the only person in Cedar Falls who was starting to see through Dr. Vance's operation. I drove to Main Street and found Chen's Hardware, just as Tom was locking up for the evening. He was a man in his 50s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, with the calloused hands of someone who'd worked physically his entire life. When I introduced myself as Charles Brooks' daughter, his entire demeanor changed. "Your father was a good man," he said immediately. I was sorry to hear about his passing. Heart attack, wasn't it? That's what they said? Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about some financial matters. I'm researching local business history, and I understand your family has deep ties to the community. Tom glanced up and down the empty street, then unlocked his store again. Come inside. This isn't a conversation for the sidewalk. The hardware store smelled like oil and metal. Familiar scents that reminded me of helping my father with weekend projects when I was young. Tom led me to a small office in the back, where he immediately pulled out a bottle of whiskey and poured himself a generous glass. You want some? Because what I'm about to tell you, you're going to need it. I accepted the glass, noting that his hands were shaking slightly. My family's been getting robbed for 3 years, he said without preamble. Robbed by people we trusted, people we thought were helping us. And I think your father figured it out before he died. The whiskey burned, but it steadied my nerves. Tell me everything. Tom's story was painfully familiar. His son David had started having behavioral problems in college, struggling with anxiety and depression. A family friend had recommended Dr. Helena Vance, praising her expertise with young adults facing life transitions. David had been seeing her for 4 years now. At first, it seemed to help. David became more focused, more compliant with family expectations. He started working in the store, learning the business. But he also became different. Distant. Like he was going through the motions of being our son without really being present. I thought of Ryan's vacant stares, his mechanical responses to questions. Dr. Vance suggested we set up a trust fund for David's future, to give him security and motivation to take over the family business. She recommended a lawyer, Patricia Wells, who handled all the paperwork. We thought we were being responsible parents. Patricia Wells. I'd seen her name on dozens of documents in the foundation files. But then I started noticing that money was disappearing from the trust. Not all at once, but steadily, month after month. When I asked Patricia about it, she showed me documentation proving that David had authorized the withdrawals for various educational and business expenses. Had he authorized them? Tom's laugh was bitter. That's what I asked David. And he looked at me with those blank eyes and said yes, he'd approved everything. It was all for his development and future success. Said it exactly like he was reciting lines from a script. He poured himself another drink, his hands steadier now. So I started investigating on my own. Found out that the trust funds were being donated to the Cedar Falls Community Foundation, supposedly for programs that would benefit David's education and career development. But when I tried to find these programs to see what our money was actually funding, I couldn't find anything real. What did you do? I went to your father. Charles had helped me set up the business insurance for the store years ago, and I knew he was good with financial details. I asked him to look at the trust documentation, see if he could spot anything I was missing. My heart started racing. What did he find? He found exactly what I suspected. The trust was a sham. The foundation was a sham. Even the lawyer, Patricia Wells, wasn't who she claimed to be. Her credentials were fake, her law degree was from a diploma mill, and her office address was a mail forwarding service. Tom reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. Your father gave me copies of everything he'd discovered. Said he was building a case, that he'd found similar patterns with other families in town. He was going to the state attorney general as soon as he had enough evidence. When was this? 2 weeks before he died. The timeline matched perfectly with my father's appointment with the toxicologist. Tom handed me the folder. I've been too scared to do anything with this since Charles passed. But if you're investigating the same things he was, maybe together we can finish what he started. I opened the folder and my father's handwriting jumped out at me. Pages of notes, financial calculations, copies of documents I recognized from my own research. But there was more. Evidence I hadn't found yet. Dad had discovered that Dr. Vance wasn't working alone. She was part of a network of therapists and lawyers operating throughout Oregon and Washington, all using the same techniques to identify wealthy families and systematically drain their assets through fake foundations and shell companies. The Cedar Falls operation was just one branch of a criminal enterprise that had stolen tens of millions of dollars from families across the Pacific Northwest. And according to Dad's notes, They had identified him as a threat. The last entry in his notebook was dated 3 days before his death. They know I'm investigating. Carol has been asking strange questions about my research. Need to move fast. Evidence hidden in safety deposit box. Key in the shed behind the garden tools. My mother had been reporting on my father's investigation to Dr. Vance. My own mother had been complicit in my father's murder. I sat in Tom Chen's office holding my father's final notes and felt something inside me harden into cold determination. They had killed my father to protect their criminal operation. They had turned my husband into a puppet and my mother into a co-conspirator. They had stolen millions from families like the Chens, people who had worked their entire lives to build something for their children. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that by eliminating my father and controlling my husband, they could continue their operation without interference. They hadn't anticipated that I would discover the truth, or that my father had been smart enough to hide evidence where I could find it. Tom, how many other families do you think are being victimized? He pulled out a sheet of paper covered with names. I've identified at least 15 families in Cedar Falls, probably more in the surrounding towns. All of them have someone seeing Dr. Vance or one of her associates. All of them have had unusual financial transactions in recent years. 15 families. Millions of dollars. Years of systematic theft, disguised as community charity and family financial planning. What do you want to do about it? Tom's eyes hardened. I want to destroy them. All of them. I want to get my son back, get our money back, and make sure they never do this to another family. That's going to be dangerous. If they killed my father for investigating them, they won't hesitate to come after us. I know, but your father was working alone, trying to build a case by himself. We have each other now, and we have his research as a starting point. We can be smarter about it. I thought about everything I'd learned, everything I'd overheard at my mother's house. They're planning to accelerate their timeline. Something about the trust funds needing to be transferred within 6 weeks. If we're going to stop them, we need to move fast. What do you have in mind? I looked at my father's notes, at the evidence Tom had collected, at the photographs I'd taken of the foundation records. We're going to do exactly what my father was planning to do. We're going to build an airtight case and take it to the authorities. But we're also going to do something he couldn't do. What's that? We're going to rescue the people they've conditioned, starting with Ryan and your son David. Tom nodded grimly. How do we break psychological conditioning that's been built up over years? I don't know yet, but I know someone who might. I thought of the research I'd done on Dr. Vance's background, the studies that had been shut down by ethics committees. There were other researchers involved in her early work, people who raised ethical concerns about her methods. If we can find them, they might know how to reverse what she's done. We spent the next hour planning our investigation strategy. Tom would continue gathering information about affected families in Cedar Falls, being careful not to alert anyone to his suspicions. I would drive to Portland and track down the researchers who had worked with Dr. Vance, looking for information about her conditioning techniques and possible ways to counteract them. But first, I needed to retrieve my father's hidden evidence from the safety deposit box. The next morning, I met Tom at Cedar Falls First National Bank. Dad's safety deposit box key had been exactly where his notes indicated, hidden behind a loose board in the garden shed. The bank manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, had known my father for years and expressed sympathy about his passing as she led us to the vault. Your father was very particular about this box, she mentioned casually, visited it regularly, always bringing documents in and out. Very organized man. The safety deposit box contained more evidence than I had dared hope for. Financial records, photographs, audio recordings, and most importantly, contacts with other victims and investigators across the Pacific Northwest. My father hadn't just been building a case against the Cedar Falls operation. He'd been coordinating with people in Seattle, Portland, and Spokane who were investigating similar crimes. There was even a letter addressed to me, sealed and dated just days before his death. I opened it with trembling hands. Natalie, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me and you've discovered the truth about what's been happening to our family and our community. I'm sorry you have to learn about this under these circumstances. but I'm proud that you've been brave enough to investigate what others have ignored or covered up. Dr. Helena Vance and her associates have been stealing from families for years, using psychological manipulation techniques that are both sophisticated and deeply unethical. Your husband Ryan is as much a victim as anyone, though his conditioning may be so complete that reversing it will be extremely difficult. I'm most sorry to tell you that your mother has been involved in this operation from the beginning. Carol was recruited 8 years ago when she was struggling with depression after her library position was eliminated. Dr. Vance offered her work as what she called a, quote, community liaison, helping to identify families who might benefit from financial planning services. By the time Carol realized she was helping to victimize people, she was too deeply involved to extract herself without facing criminal charges. I believe Carol genuinely loves you, but her fear of prosecution has made her complicit in crimes she never intended to commit. This doesn't excuse her actions, but I hope it helps you understand her motivations. The evidence in this box should be sufficient to bring down the entire network, but you'll need allies. Contact Detective Marcus Reed with the Oregon State Police Financial Crimes Division. I've been working with him for months, and he's clean. You can trust him. Be careful, Natalie. These people have already killed to protect their operation, and they won't hesitate to do it again. But don't let fear stop you from seeking justice for all the families they've harmed. I love you, and I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this. Dad. I sat in the bank vault, holding my father's final letter, and cried for the first time since discovering the conspiracy. Not just for him, but for Ryan, for my mother, for Tom's son David, and all the other victims whose lives had been stolen by Dr. Vance's manipulations. But when the tears stopped, what remained was a cold, focused anger that felt like nothing I'd ever experienced before. Tom placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. What do you want to do first? I folded the letter carefully and looked at the boxes of evidence surrounding us. We're going to contact Detective Reed and turn over everything my father collected. Then we're going to Portland to find those researchers. And then we're going to Cedar Falls to start documenting everything we can about the current operation. And after that, I thought about Ryan sitting in my mother's kitchen, staring straight ahead while waiting for instructions. I thought about David Chen, mechanically working in his father's store while his trust fund was systematically drained. I thought about my father, asking questions about his investments right up until someone decided those questions made him too dangerous to live. After that, we're going to destroy them completely. Detective Marcus Reed met us at a quiet diner outside Salem, halfway between Cedar Falls and Portland. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with graying temples and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much corruption in his career. When Tom and I walked in carrying boxes of evidence, he didn't seem surprised. You must be Natalie. Your father spoke about you often. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry it's taken this long for us to connect. His handshake was firm, his voice carrying genuine sympathy. Charles was building something important before he died. I'm glad to see you're continuing his work. We spread the documents across 3 tables in the back corner of the diner, far from other customers. Detective Reed examined each piece of evidence with the methodical attention of someone who understood financial crimes, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. This is even more extensive than what your father had shown me, he said after an hour of review. The network spans at least 4 states now. We've been tracking similar operations in Washington, Idaho, and Northern California, all using the same basic structure: psychological conditioning of key family members, fake foundations for money laundering, and shell companies to hide the final destinations of the funds. Tom leaned forward. How many people are we talking about? Based on what we've identified so far, probably over 200 families. Conservative estimate is that they've stolen around $60 million over the past decade, though it could be significantly more. The number was staggering: $60 million taken from hardworking families who thought they were planning for their children's futures. Detective Reed pulled out his own files. What your father discovered, and what you've confirmed with this new evidence, is that Dr. Vance isn't the mastermind. She's a regional director in a much larger operation. He showed us organizational charts that looked like something from a corporate presentation. The operation is run by a group calling itself the Pacific Development Institute. They present themselves as a research organization focused on behavioral psychology and community development. In reality, they're running the most sophisticated financial fraud scheme we've ever encountered. Who's running it? Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, formerly a professor at Stanford until he was forced to resign over ethics violations. He's been operating out of Seattle for the past 12 years, recruiting therapists, lawyers, and financial advisors to implement his system across the region. The name meant nothing to me, but Detective Reed's expression suggested it should. Whitmore developed most of the psychological conditioning techniques that Dr. Vance uses. He's brilliant, absolutely ruthless, and completely without conscience. We've been trying to build a case against him for 3 years, but he's very careful to maintain distance from the actual criminal activities. What about the people who've been conditioned? Can it be reversed? Detective Reed's expression grew grim. That's the most troubling aspect of this whole operation. Whitmore's techniques are designed to be permanent. The conditioning creates what he calls, quote, stable compliance patterns that persist even when the subject is removed from the conditioning environment. My heart sank thinking about Ryan, about David Chen, about all the victims who might never recover their authentic selves. However, the detective continued, we've been working with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a deprogramming specialist in Portland, who's had some success with similar cases. She's agreed to consult on this investigation, particularly with victim recovery. Tom and I exchanged glances. This was the break we'd been hoping for. There's something else you need to know, Detective Reed said, his voice dropping lower. Your father's death wasn't the first. We've identified at least 6 suspicious deaths over the past 5 years. All people who were asking questions about their finances or their family members' behavior changes. The diner suddenly felt too warm, too exposed. 6 people killed to protect this operation. Are Tom and I in danger? Probably yes, which is why we need to move fast and smart. I've been authorized to offer you both protection, but more importantly, I need your help to set up a controlled sting operation. What kind of sting? Detective Reed pulled out a map of Oregon with red pins, marking various locations. Dr. Vance is planning to accelerate the asset transfers from the Cedar Falls families within the next month. We know this because we've been monitoring some of their communications through a federal wiretap authorization. He pointed to several pins clustered around Cedar Falls. She's scheduled what she calls completion sessions with at least 12 families, including yours and Tom's. These sessions are designed to finalize the psychological conditioning and authorize the final transfer of trust funds. Completion sessions? Based on our intelligence, these are intensive conditioning appointments where the subjects are given final instructions about their financial decisions and their ongoing compliance with family directives. After these sessions, the conditioning becomes essentially irreversible. I thought about Ryan sitting in my mother's kitchen, staring straight ahead while Dr. Vance gave him instructions. If she completed his conditioning, would I ever be able to reach the real person underneath? We want to interrupt these sessions and arrest Dr. Vance in the act of psychological manipulation. But we need someone on the inside to coordinate the timing and provide evidence of what actually happens during the conditioning process. Tom was already shaking his head. You want us to go undercover? To pretend we don't know what's happening while they try to complete the conditioning on our family members. It's dangerous, I won't lie about that. But it's also our best chance to gather the evidence we need to bring down the entire network. And it's the only way we might be able to save the people who've been conditioned. I stared at the map, at all those red pins representing families who were about to lose everything. What exactly would we need to do? Natalie, you'd need to reconcile with Ryan. Convince Dr. Vance that you're reconsidering the divorce, that you want to work on the marriage. She'll see this as an opportunity to complete Ryan's conditioning, while also gaining access to your trust funds. The idea of pretending to reconcile with Ryan, of walking back into that web of manipulation and lies, made me physically sick. But I thought about my father's letter, about his hope that I would seek justice for all the affected families. Tom, you'd continue expressing concerns about your son David's behavior and your family's finances. Let Dr. Vance think you're confused and looking for guidance. She'll schedule completion sessions for David to ensure his continued compliance. Tom was quiet for a long moment. How do we protect David and Ryan during this process? If these sessions make the conditioning permanent, Dr. Martinez has developed some techniques for creating psychological resistance to further conditioning. It's not foolproof, but it can help subjects maintain some awareness of what's being done to them. We'd need to work with both Ryan and David before the sting operation begins. Detective Reed spread out more documents. There's something else. We believe your mother, Carol, is being conditioned as well. Not to the same extent as the primary targets, but enough to ensure her continued compliance and silence. This explained so much about my mother's recent behavior, her willingness to participate in something she must have known was wrong. She wasn't just a co-conspirator motivated by fear or greed. She was another victim. Can we help her too? Possibly. Dr. Martinez would need to evaluate her, but adult conditioning is often easier to reverse than the deep programming used on younger subjects like Ryan and David. I looked at Tom, seeing my own mix of fear and determination reflected in his expression. If we do this, if we go undercover to help with your sting operation, what happens to our families afterward? Assuming we succeed? Full witness protection if needed, though we hope it won't come to that. Financial restitution from recovered assets. And access to the best deprogramming specialists in the country for family members who've been conditioned. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope. More hope than we'd had when we walked into this diner. There's one more thing, Detective Reed said. We need to coordinate this sting with similar operations in Washington and California. Whitmore's organization is planning a major financial transfer in 6 weeks. If we can arrest the regional directors simultaneously, we can prevent them from alerting the central operation and destroying evidence. Tom nodded slowly. So this isn't just about Cedar Falls anymore, it's about bringing down the entire network. Exactly. Your father understood that, Natalie. He knew that stopping Dr. Vance would only be meaningful if we could also stop the people who created and directed her operation. We spent the next 2 hours working out the details of the undercover operation. Detective Reed would coordinate with Dr. Martinez to begin psychological preparation for Ryan, David, and my mother. Tom and I would return to Cedar Falls and begin playing our assigned roles, carefully documenting everything while pretending to be oblivious to the true nature of what was happening. Most importantly, we would wear recording devices during all interactions with Dr. Vance and her associates, building an evidentiary record that could be used to prosecute the entire network. As we prepared to leave the diner, Detective Reed handed me a secure phone. This connects directly to our task force. If you feel like you're in immediate danger, call immediately. Don't try to handle anything alone. Driving back to Cedar Falls, Tom and I barely spoke. The magnitude of what we were about to attempt was overwhelming. We were going to walk back into the heart of a criminal operation that had already killed 6 people, pretending to be innocent while secretly working to expose them. But we were also going to try to save our families and dozens of other victims who had no idea they were being systematically robbed and psychologically manipulated. That evening, I sat in my Portland apartment and made the most difficult phone call of my life. Ryan? It's Natalie. I've been thinking about us. About the divorce. And I wonder if we made a mistake. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Ryan finally spoke, his voice had that familiar mechanical quality I'd learned to recognize as a sign of his conditioning. I've been hoping you would call. Dr. Vance said that sometimes couples need space before they can see clearly. Of course, Dr. Vance had predicted this. She'd probably been expecting my call since the day I'd overheard the conversation at my mother's house. I'd like to see you. Maybe we could talk about trying again. I'd like that very much. Should I come to Portland? Actually, I was thinking of coming back to Cedar Falls for a few days. Maybe staying at Mom's house, if that's okay with you. Your mother would be delighted. She's been worried about you being alone in the city. I'll bet she has. We arranged for me to drive down the next weekend. Ryan would pick me up at my mother's house, and we would spend time together, talking about our relationship and our future. Dr. Vance would undoubtedly want to meet with us, to assess the situation and plan how to proceed with Ryan's final conditioning. After hanging up, I called Tom to let him know the first phase of our operation was in motion. I talked to David tonight, he reported. told him I was concerned about some of the financial decisions we've been making, that I wanted to understand the trust fund management better. He immediately suggested we schedule a meeting with Dr. Vance to discuss family financial planning. When? Next Wednesday. She apparently has time in her schedule for what she called an, quote, intensive family consultation session. 3 days before I was supposed to arrive in Cedar Falls for my reconciliation weekend with Ryan. The timing felt deliberately coordinated, as if Dr. Vance was preparing to finalize her operations with both families simultaneously. The next day, I met with Dr. Sarah Martinez at her Portland clinic. She was a small, intense woman in her 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through to whatever psychological mechanisms were driving human behavior. Detective Reed has briefed me on your situation, she said without preamble. What you're attempting is extremely dangerous, not just physically but psychologically. Extended exposure to sophisticated conditioning techniques can affect even people who know what's happening to them. What do you mean? Dr. Vance and her associates use a combination of drugs, environmental manipulation, and what's called reality distortion to break down their subjects' resistance to suggestion. Even if you're aware of the techniques, prolonged exposure can begin to affect your judgment and decision-making. She handed me a small device that looked like a hearing aid. This will provide a constant, low-level audio signal designed to interfere with the brainwave patterns that conditioning techniques rely on. It won't completely protect you, but it should help you maintain psychological resistance. Dr. Martinez also gave me detailed instructions on recognizing the signs of conditioning in progress, techniques for supporting Ryan and my mother without alerting Dr. Vance to my awareness, and emergency protocols if the psychological pressure became too intense. The most important thing to remember is that everyone involved in this operation, including your mother and your ex-husband, are victims. Their actions are not representative of their authentic selves. Whatever they say or do during the conditioning sessions, remember that it's the result of psychological manipulation, not their genuine thoughts or feelings. This was going to be crucial to remember when I had to watch Dr. Vance complete Ryan's conditioning, when I had to pretend to reconcile with a man who had been turned into a puppet, when I had to smile and accept guidance from a mother who had been made complicit in my father's murder. Dr. Martinez, what are the chances that we can actually reverse the conditioning that's already been done? Her expression was carefully neutral. It depends on several factors: the duration and intensity of the conditioning, the individual's psychological resilience, and how quickly we can begin the recovery process. Some people recover completely. Others retain lasting effects. And some people don't recover at all? Some people don't recover at all, she confirmed quietly. I left Dr. Martinez's clinic with a deeper understanding of what we were risking, but also with better tools to protect myself and hopefully help the people I cared about. The psychological protection device was hidden in my ear, the emergency protocols were memorized, and I had a clearer sense of what to expect during the conditioning sessions. But most importantly, I had professional confirmation that what we were attempting was possible. Dangerous? Yes, but possible. The drive to Cedar Falls that Friday felt like entering enemy territory. Every familiar landmark, every childhood memory spot, was now tainted by the knowledge of what had been happening in my hometown for years. The place where I'd grown up safe and loved had been the center of a criminal operation that had destroyed families and murdered anyone who got too close to the truth. My mother was waiting on the front porch when I pulled into the driveway, her smile bright and welcoming. But now I could see the signs of psychological manipulation that I'd missed before. The slight delay before her emotional responses, the way her expressions seemed just a bit too controlled, the manner in which her words sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Dr. Vance had conditioned my mother just enough to ensure her compliance, but not enough to completely eliminate her genuine personality. It was a delicate balance that probably required ongoing maintenance sessions to sustain. Natalie, sweetheart, I'm so glad you decided to come home. Her embrace felt real, but her words carried that subtle mechanical quality I'd learned to recognize. I've missed you, Mom. And I've been thinking a lot about family, about what's really important. Something flickered in her eyes, a moment of what might have been genuine emotion breaking through the conditioning. But it passed quickly, replaced by the controlled warmth that had become her default expression. Ryan will be here soon. He's been looking forward to seeing you all week. I'll bet he has. Or rather, I'll bet his programming has been anticipating this reunion as part of Dr. Vance's larger plan. As we sat in the living room waiting for Ryan's arrival, I noticed details that had escaped my attention during previous visits. The furniture had been rearranged slightly, creating what Dr. Martinez had warned me were psychological comfort zones, designed to make subjects more receptive to suggestion. There were new decorative elements, colors, and patterns that research had shown could influence mood and decision-making. Even my childhood home had been turned into a tool for psychological manipulation. When Ryan's truck pulled into the driveway, my heart rate spiked, despite all my preparation. I was about to spend an entire weekend pretending to reconcile with a man who had been programmed to manipulate me, while secretly working to expose the people who had destroyed our marriage and stolen our lives. But as I watched Ryan walk up the front steps, moving with that careful precision that indicated active conditioning, I reminded myself of Dr. Martinez's words. He was a victim, not a villain. Whatever happened this weekend, whatever he said or did, it wasn't really him. The real Ryan was still in there somewhere, and if our operation succeeded, we might actually be able to find him again. My mother opened the door with a bright smile. "Ryan, come in. Natalie's been waiting for you." He stepped into the house, and for a moment our eyes met. In that instant, I saw something that made my breath catch. A flicker of recognition, of confusion, as if some part of him was struggling against the programming. But then the moment passed, and his expression returned to that familiar blank compliance. "Hello, Natalie. Thank you for agreeing to see me." His voice was perfectly modulated, his words carefully chosen. But there had been something in his eyes, just for a second, that gave me hope. Maybe the real Ryan was closer to the surface than Dr. Vance realized. Maybe the weekend ahead would be our chance to reach him before the conditioning became permanent. Or maybe I was seeing what I wanted to see, and the man I'd married was already gone forever. There was only one way to find out. The weekend unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, where everyone knew the steps except me. Ryan arrived each morning at precisely 9 o'clock, bringing coffee from the local cafe and speaking in measured tones about our future together. My mother hovered nearby, making supportive comments about second chances and the importance of family unity. Everything felt scripted, rehearsed, artificial. But I was watching for something else now. The micro-expressions that Dr. Martinez had taught me to recognize. The momentary confusion that flickered across Ryan's face when he encountered something unexpected. The way his mechanical responses sometimes lagged by a split second, as if two different parts of his mind were competing for control. On Saturday afternoon, as we walked through Riverside Park where we'd had our first date 6 years ago, I decided to test the boundaries of his conditioning. "Do you remember our first kiss?" I asked, stopping by the old wooden bridge where it had happened. Ryan paused, his programmed response clearly searching for the appropriate reply. Of course. It was meaningful to both of us. Generic. Safe? Exactly what someone with incomplete memories might say. What was I wearing? Another pause, longer this time. Something shifted behind his eyes, a moment of genuine struggle. You had on. He stopped, pressing his fingers to his temples. I'm sorry, I've been having headaches lately. Dr. Vance says they're stress-related. I'll bet she does. The headaches were probably his authentic self, trying to break through the artificial memories and responses that had been implanted over years of conditioning. That's okay. We can make new memories. But as I said it, I saw him flinch slightly. Not the response Dr. Vance would have programmed into him. This was something deeper. Some part of Ryan that recognized the terrible loss of what we'd once had together. That evening, my mother prepared dinner with an enthusiasm that felt forced. She'd always been a good cook, but tonight every dish was perfectly executed, as if she was following a recipe for family harmony rather than simply making a meal. The conversation flowed in predetermined directions. My work in Portland, Ryan's progress with the family business, our shared hopes for the future. But underneath the surface performance, I was building my case. The recording device hidden in my jacket captured every word, every subtle manipulation, every moment when their programmed responses revealed the artificial nature of their behavior. Detective Reed would have hours of evidence showing the conditioning in action. After dinner, Ryan excused himself to make a phone call. I volunteered to clear the dishes, giving me a chance to be alone with my mother in the kitchen. "Mom, can I ask you something?" She turned from the sink, her expression cautiously pleasant. "Of course, sweetheart." "Do you ever feel like you're not quite yourself anymore? Like you're going through the motions of being you without really feeling connected to your own thoughts?" For a moment, the mask slipped completely. Fear flashed across her features, followed by confusion, then a desperate kind of recognition. She opened her mouth as if to respond honestly, but then her expression smoothed back into programmed calm. "I'm not sure what you mean, dear. I feel like myself." But her hands were shaking as she said it. "Mom, if someone was making you do things you didn't want to do, making you hurt people you love, you could tell me. We could figure out how to stop it." The internal struggle was visible on her face. Whatever conditioning Dr. Vance had used on her wasn't as complete as Ryan's, but it was strong enough to prevent her from breaking free on her own. "Natalie, I think you're reading too much into things. Sometimes when we're stressed, we imagine problems that aren't really there." It was exactly the kind of gaslighting response that Dr. Vance had probably trained her to use. But the way my mother's voice cracked slightly on the last word told me that somewhere underneath the programming, she was screaming for help. Sunday afternoon brought the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating. Dr. Vance called to invite Ryan and me for what she termed a relationship consultation session that evening. The timing was perfect from her perspective. After a weekend of reconciliation, we would be psychologically primed for her final manipulation. What she didn't know was that Tom Chen had attended his quote-quote family financial planning session with Dr. Vance earlier that week, wearing recording equipment that had captured everything. Detective Reed now had evidence of her using psychological conditioning techniques to manipulate David Chen into authorizing massive fund transfers from his family's trust. The session was scheduled for 7 o'clock at Dr. Vance's private office, a converted Victorian house on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. As Ryan and I drove there together, I noticed his hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. "Are you nervous about the session?" I asked. "Dr. Vance says that relationship counseling can bring up unexpected emotions. She's prepared for that." "I'll bet she is." Dr. Martinez had warned me that the final conditioning sessions often involved pharmaceutical assistance to break down psychological resistance. I had the antidote medication hidden in a hollowed-out pen in my purse, but I would only have one chance to use it if Dr. Vance tried to drug me. The office building looked innocent enough from the outside, a charming Victorian with a small brass plaque identifying it as the Vance Center for Behavioral Health. But as we walked up the front steps, I noticed details that sent chills down my spine. Security cameras positioned to capture every angle of approach. Windows that had been modified with what looked like soundproofing material. A parking area that was completely hidden from the street. This wasn't just a therapy office. It was a facility designed to contain people who might not want to be there. Dr. Vance greeted us in the elegant lobby, wearing a dove gray suit that projected professional authority. Her smile was warm and welcoming, but her eyes assessed us with clinical precision. "Natalie, Ryan, I'm so pleased you've decided to work on your relationship. Many couples benefit from intensive therapeutic intervention during times of transition." Intensive therapeutic intervention. The euphemism was chilling. She led us down a hallway lined with framed diplomas and awards, all designed to reinforce her credentials and authority. But I noticed something Dr. Martinez had warned me to watch for. The hallway had no windows and only one exit. Once we were in her office, we would be completely under her control. The office itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. The lighting was slightly dimmer than normal, inducing a mild relaxation response. The chairs were positioned to make me feel smaller and more vulnerable, while elevating Dr. Vance's position of authority. Even the color scheme had been chosen to promote compliance and reduce critical thinking. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. I thought we'd begin with some individual conversations before bringing you together for joint exercises." She gestured for Ryan to follow her to a separate room, leaving me alone in the main office. This was part of the plan Detective Reed had briefed me on. Isolate the subjects, work on them individually to reduce their psychological defenses, then bring them back together for the final conditioning. While they were gone, I used the opportunity to examine the office more carefully. Hidden cameras in the corners, exactly as I'd expected. A cabinet that was locked but probably contained the pharmaceutical supplies Dr. Martinez had warned me about. Most telling of all, a bookshelf that included multiple volumes on hypnotic techniques, behavioral modification, and what the academic literature euphemistically called compliance therapy. When Ryan returned 20 minutes later, his movements were even more mechanical than before. His pupils were slightly dilated, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who was heavily medicated, but trying to hide it. Dr. Vance had drugged him. "How are you feeling?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Relaxed. Focused. Dr. Vance helped me clarify some thoughts that had been unclear. His voice was flatter than I'd ever heard it, completely drained of personality or individual expression. Whatever she'd done to him in that room, it had pushed his conditioning to a new level. Now it was my turn. Dr. Vance led me to the same small room where she'd just finished working on Ryan. It was even more carefully designed than the main office. No windows, soft lighting that made it difficult to judge time accurately, and a chair that was positioned to make me feel psychologically vulnerable. "Natalie, I want you to know how pleased I am that you've decided to give your marriage another chance. Ryan has been working very hard to become the husband you deserve." She settled into her chair with the confidence of someone who had complete control over the situation. What she didn't know was that every word was being recorded by devices that were undetectable to her security systems. "I appreciate everything you've done for Ryan. He seems much more focused since he started seeing you." That's exactly what we hope to achieve. Many young people struggle with the transition to adult responsibilities, particularly around marriage and financial planning. Our therapeutic approach helps them develop the decision-making skills they need to succeed. Decision-making skills, another euphemism for psychological conditioning. I have to admit, I'm curious about your methods. Ryan's changes have been so dramatic. Dr. Vance's eyes sharpened slightly. This was dangerous territory, but I needed her to reveal enough detail about her techniques to provide evidence for the prosecution. We use a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy, medication when appropriate, and what I call environmental restructuring to help clients overcome self-defeating thought patterns. Environmental restructuring? We help clients understand how their social and financial environments can either support or undermine their psychological health. Sometimes this involves making changes to living situations, social connections, or financial arrangements that create stress and confusion, like isolating victims from support systems and gaining control over their finances. That makes sense. Ryan mentioned that you've been helping him with some business decisions lately. Financial stress is one of the leading causes of marital discord. When we can help young people make sound financial choices, their relationships often improve dramatically. She was confident, comfortable, completely convinced that she had me exactly where she wanted me, which made what happened next even more satisfying. "Dr. Vance, I have to ask you about something that's been bothering me." "Of course. Open communication is essential for successful therapy." Tom Chen mentioned that his son David has been making some unusual financial decisions lately. Large transfers from the family trust to various charitable organizations. Tom's concerned because David doesn't seem to remember authorizing these transfers. The change in Dr. Vance's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. The professional warmth remained, but her eyes went completely cold. "I'm afraid I can't discuss other clients, even in general terms. Patient confidentiality is sacrosanct in my practice." "Oh, I understand completely. It's just that Tom seemed so worried. He's been asking questions around town, trying to understand what's happening with David's behavior." Now I had her attention. The suggestion that Tom was asking questions publicly would be deeply threatening to someone running a criminal operation that depended on secrecy. Sometimes family members misunderstand the therapeutic process. They see positive changes in their loved ones and interpret them as problems rather than progress. That could be it. Although Tom did mention that he'd spoken to some other families about similar concerns, the Williams family, the Patterson family. He said several parents had noticed unusual financial activities after their children started therapy. Dr. Vance was no longer pretending to be relaxed. Her posture had shifted into something more predatory, more alert. Mr. Chen should be careful about spreading rumors or concerns that might interfere with ongoing therapeutic relationships. Sometimes worried family members can inadvertently undermine the progress their loved ones are making. The threat was clear. Stop asking questions or face consequences. I'm sure you're right. Tom's probably just being an overprotective father. But I'd accomplished what I needed to. Dr. Vance now knew that at least one family was asking dangerous questions about her operation. She would have to respond. And that response would give Detective Reed the justification he needed to move forward with arrests. Natalie, I'd like to try a relaxation exercise with you. Many people find that therapeutic techniques work better when they're in a calm, receptive state of mind. Here it comes. The attempt to condition me the same way she'd conditioned Ryan, my mother, and dozens of other victims. That sounds wonderful. I've been so stressed lately. Dr. Vance moved to the locked cabinet I'd noticed earlier and removed a small bottle and syringe. This is just a mild anti-anxiety medication. Many of my clients find it helpful during intensive sessions. The medication that would make me compliant and suggestible, allowing her to implant whatever responses and behaviors she needed to complete her financial theft. Is it safe? I've never been comfortable with taking medications I don't recognize. Completely safe. FDA approved for anxiety treatment. The dose is very small, just enough to help you relax. She prepared the injection with practiced efficiency, but I noticed that her hands were slightly unsteady. The conversation about Tom Chen and other families asking questions had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. As she approached with the syringe, I made my decision. Dr. Vance, before we continue, I need to tell you something. She paused, the needle inches from my arm. I know about the Cedar Falls Community Foundation. I know about the fake property renovations. I know about the trust funds you've been stealing from families like mine. Her mask didn't just slip this time. It shattered completely. The professional warmth vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating that made my skin crawl. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Natalie. Perhaps the stress of your marital problems is causing you to develop some paranoid thoughts. But her hand holding the syringe was now visibly shaking. I know you killed my father because he was asking too many questions about his property investments. I know you've been conditioning Ryan for years to make him compliant with your financial schemes. And I know you've turned my mother into an unwilling accomplice through psychological manipulation. Dr. Vance set down the syringe and moved to her desk, where she pressed a button that I assumed would summon help. What she didn't know was that Detective Reed's team had been monitoring the building since we'd arrived. Natalie, you're clearly experiencing a psychological break. I'm going to call someone to help you. The only person who needs help is you. Because in about 30 seconds, this building is going to be surrounded by Oregon State Police, and you're going to be arrested for fraud, conspiracy, and murder. As if summoned by my words, the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the parking lot outside. Through the small window, I could see tactical team vehicles positioning themselves around the building. Dr. Vance's composure cracked completely. She lunged for another cabinet, this one containing what looked like files and computer equipment. But before she could reach it, the office door burst open. Oregon State Police! Dr. Helena Vance, you're under arrest. Detective Reed and his team flooded into the room, weapons drawn, moving with the precision of professionals who had planned this operation down to the smallest detail. Dr. Vance was on the ground in handcuffs before she could destroy a single piece of evidence. But the most important moment came when they brought Ryan in from the main office. The drugs Dr. Vance had given him were still affecting his system. But as he saw her being arrested, something shifted in his expression. Confusion at first, then a growing awareness that something was very wrong. Natalie? What's happening? Why are there police here? His voice sounded different. Less mechanical, more uncertain, but also more human than I'd heard it in years. It's gonna be okay, Ryan. We're gonna help you remember who you really are. As Detective Reed's team processed the crime scene and arrested Dr. Vance, I called Tom Chen to let him know that our operation had succeeded. His voice was thick with emotion when he answered. David's at the hospital with Dr. Martinez right now. She says the conditioning was extensive, but she thinks he can recover. How's Ryan? I watched my ex-husband sitting in an ambulance, being evaluated by paramedics who were trained to recognize the effects of conditioning drugs. He kept looking around with the expression of someone waking up from a very long, very confusing dream. I think he's going to be okay too. It's going to take time, but I think we got to him before the conditioning became permanent. That night, as Dr. Vance was processed into the Oregon State Correction System, and evidence teams worked through the night cataloging years of financial crimes, I sat with my mother in her living room. The woman who had raised me was also beginning to wake up from her artificial compliance, though the process was clearly painful and disorienting. Natalie, I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you, wanted to warn you, but every time I tried, I just couldn't. It was like the words wouldn't come. Mom, it wasn't your fault. Dr. Vance used sophisticated techniques to control your behavior. You're as much a victim as anyone else. But even as I comforted her, I knew that our relationship would never be the same. The trust that had been shattered by years of deception and manipulation would take years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. Detective Reed called at midnight with an update that brought the scope of our victory into focus. The arrests in Seattle and California were successful. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore and 6 of his regional directors are in custody. We're estimating that we've recovered over $40 million in stolen assets, and we've identified at least 180 families who were victimized by this operation. 180 families. Hundreds of people whose lives had been stolen through psychological manipulation and financial fraud. But now they would have a chance to recover, to reclaim their authentic selves, to rebuild what had been taken from them. What happens now? Now comes the hard part. Victim recovery, legal proceedings, and the process of helping conditioned individuals rebuild their identities and relationships. It's going to take years, but we've broken the back of the most sophisticated criminal psychological operation we've ever encountered. As I hung up the phone, I realized that while one chapter of this nightmare was ending, another was just beginning. Ryan and I would both need extensive therapy to understand how our relationship had been manipulated from the beginning. My mother would need help processing years of unwilling complicity. Families throughout the Pacific Northwest would need support as they discovered the true extent of what had been done to them. But for the first time in years, we had hope. Hope that the people we loved could recover their authentic selves. Hope that the criminals who had destroyed so many lives would face justice. And hope that we could rebuild our community into something stronger and more honest than what had been taken from us. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but we were finally free to walk it as ourselves. 6 months after Dr. Vance's arrest, I stood in the renovated community center that had once housed her psychological manipulation operation. The building now served as a recovery facility for conditioning victims, staffed by Dr. Martinez and a team of specialists who understood the complex process of rebuilding authentic identity after years of artificial programming. Ryan was in his 3rd month of intensive deprogramming therapy. The man I encountered during our weekly meetings bore little resemblance to either the person I'd married or the puppet Dr. Vance had created. He was quieter now, more uncertain, but increasingly genuine in ways that reminded me of fleeting moments from our early relationship. I remember planning our wedding, he told me during one session, his voice filled with wonder at the recovered memory. Not the ceremony your mother wanted or the reception, Dr. Vance suggested. I remember wanting to elope to somewhere by the ocean, just the 2 of us. We had eloped eventually to a small ceremony at Cannon Beach that felt like marrying a stranger who happened to share my ex-husband's face. The real Ryan, the one who had wanted intimacy over spectacle, had been buried so deeply under conditioning that even he hadn't known he existed. Do you think? He hesitated, a vulnerability in his expression that would have been impossible during his conditioned years. Do you think there's a chance we could try again? Not pick up where we left off, but start over completely? It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The honest answer was complicated, layered with grief for what we'd lost and uncertainty about what might be possible. I don't know, Ryan. We'd both be different people in a new relationship. That's not necessarily bad, but it's not the same as recovering what we had before. He nodded with a maturity that his conditioned self had never possessed. I understand. I just want you to know that I remember loving you. The real you, not the version of you that Dr. Vance wanted me to control. These conversations were part of the healing process Dr. Martinez had outlined for both of us. Honest acknowledgement of what had been lost, careful exploration of what might be rebuilt, and the recognition that some damage might be irreparable. My mother's recovery had been more straightforward but perhaps more painful. Unlike Ryan's deep conditioning, her manipulation had been designed to maintain her essential personality while suppressing specific impulses toward rebellion or questioning. When the artificial constraints were removed, she was left with the full weight of understanding what she'd done under Dr. Vance's influence. I helped them steal your inheritance, she said during one of our family therapy sessions. I watched them turn your husband into a robot, and I participated because I was too frightened to resist. Dr. Martinez guided us through these confrontations with professional skill, but there were no easy resolutions. My mother's actions, whether coerced or not, had contributed to years of deception and manipulation. Forgiveness would be a process, not a decision. Mom, you were a victim too. Dr. Vance used sophisticated techniques to break down your resistance and replace your judgment with artificial compliance. But I was an adult, Natalie. I had responsibilities to protect you and your father that I failed to meet. The guilt was consuming her, despite the evidence that her choices had been artificially constrained. Part of her recovery involved learning to distinguish between the actions she had taken under conditioning and the person she authentically was underneath the manipulation. The broader community healing proved even more complex. Cedar Falls had discovered that nearly a quarter of its established families had been victimized by Dr. Vance's network. The revelation shattered trust in institutions, relationships, and even individual self-perception, as people questioned which of their recent decisions had been authentically their own. Tom Chen had become an informal leader in the victim recovery community, organizing support groups and advocating for expanded mental health services. His son David was progressing well in therapy, though the financial conditioning had been so complete that he still struggled with basic decision-making about money. It's like learning to walk again, Tom explained during one of our weekly coordination meetings. David can understand intellectually that his trust fund decisions were manipulated, but emotionally he still feels responsible for losing our family's money. The financial recovery had been more successful than anyone had anticipated. Detective Reed's investigation had frozen accounts containing over $38 million before it could be transferred to offshore locations. The restitution process was complicated by the fact that many families hadn't known they possessed the assets that had been stolen from them. But the recovery was providing financial security that made psychological healing possible. My father's original trust, which I learned had been worth $7 million, was returned with accrued interest. The money felt tainted, connected to years of deception and his murder, but Dr. Martinez helped me understand that using it to fund victim recovery services would transform something stolen into something healing. The legal proceedings provided their own form of resolution. Dr. Brana. Vance was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and multiple counts of involuntary manslaughter. Her conditioning techniques were classified as torture under federal law, establishing legal precedent that protected future victims of similar psychological manipulation. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, the network's mastermind, received life in prison without parole. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse for the lives he'd destroyed, referring to his victims as, quote, research subjects, who had contributed to, quote, groundbreaking advances in behavioral science. The Portland law firm that had facilitated the financial fraud was dissolved, with its partners receiving sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. Patricia Wells, the fake lawyer who had manipulated trust documents for dozens of families, was sentenced to 18 years and ordered to pay full restitution to her victims. But for all the satisfaction of seeing justice served, the legal consequences couldn't restore what had been lost. Years of authentic life experience, genuine relationships, and personal development had been stolen from the victims. Some of that could never be recovered. Ryan and I ultimately decided not to attempt reconciliation as a married couple. The person I had married existed only briefly before conditioning began, and the person he was becoming through recovery was someone I needed to meet as a friend before we could consider anything more intimate. We signed final divorce papers in December, but this time the decision felt genuinely mutual, rather than manipulated. "I'm grateful that we both survived," he said, as we left the courthouse after the proceedings. "Not just physically, but as ourselves." We maintained a careful friendship built on shared understanding of what we'd experienced. Ryan began dating someone he'd met in group therapy, another conditioning victim who understood the complexity of rebuilding identity after psychological manipulation. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, with both of them committed to ensuring their feelings were authentic rather than programmed. My own healing took different forms. I left freelance journalism and returned to school for a master's degree in clinical psychology, specializing in recovery from psychological manipulation. The work felt like a calling born from personal experience rather than abstract professional interest. I also began writing a book about our experience, partly for therapeutic reasons, but primarily to document the techniques Dr. Vance had used and the warning signs that other communities might recognize. The research revealed that psychological manipulation operations similar to Cedar Falls were probably active in dozens of communities across the country, preying on families who trusted mental health professionals and financial advisors. The book proposal attracted interest from a publisher who specialized in psychological crime narratives, but I insisted that all proceeds beyond basic living expenses would fund victim recovery services. The story belonged to our entire community, not just to me. My relationship with my mother required the most careful reconstruction. We maintained contact through family therapy sessions for the first year, gradually rebuilding trust through shared work on victim advocacy projects. She volunteered at the Community Recovery Center, using her experience to help other family members understand how conditioning could make people complicit in crimes against their own loved ones. "I may never forgive myself completely," she admitted during one of our final formal therapy sessions. "But I can make sure that what happened to us helps other families recognize these warning signs before it's too late." Dr. Martinez encouraged both of us to view this ongoing service as part of the healing process, rather than penance for past actions. The distinction was important. Recovery meant building new purpose from traumatic experience, not endless punishment for decisions made under artificial influence. 2 years after Dr. Vance's arrest, Cedar Falls had transformed from a community harboring dark secrets into a model for victim recovery and prevention education. The Recovery Center hosted conferences for mental health professionals, law enforcement officers, and community leaders who wanted to understand how sophisticated psychological manipulation operations could be identified and disrupted. I addressed one such conference on the anniversary of my father's death, speaking to an audience of investigators and therapists who were tracking similar operations in their own jurisdictions. The most important lesson we learned is that psychological manipulation often looks like help, I told them. Dr. Vance presented herself as a caring professional who wanted to support families through difficult transitions. The criminal aspect was completely hidden under genuine-seeming therapeutic services. During the question period, a detective from Minnesota described a case bearing troubling similarities to our experience. A respected psychiatrist who specialized in treating young adults from wealthy families, unusual financial transactions involving community foundations, and several suspicious deaths of people who had been asking questions about their family finances. The pattern was spreading, or perhaps it had always been more widespread than anyone realized. After the conference, I drove to the Cedar Falls cemetery where my father was buried. His headstone bore a simple inscription: Charles Brooks, beloved father and seeker of truth. The phrase had been my choice, reflecting his determination to uncover the conspiracy, even when it cost him his life. I placed fresh flowers on his grave and spoke aloud the words I'd wanted to say for 3 years. "We got them, Dad. All of them. And we're making sure it doesn't happen to other families." The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the oak trees that surrounded the cemetery. The same trees I'd climbed as a child when visiting this place had been about remembering distant relatives rather than processing fresh grief. Cedar Falls felt like home again in ways it hadn't since before Dr. Vance's operation had poisoned the community's trust. As I drove back through town, I passed the hardware store where Tom Chen was teaching his son David to manage inventory and customer relationships. David moved with growing confidence, making decisions that reflected his authentic personality rather than programmed responses. The process was slow, but he was genuinely healing. I stopped by the community center where Ryan was facilitating a support group for conditioning victims. Through the window, I could see him speaking with the animated engagement of someone who had rediscovered his own voice. He looked happier than I'd ever seen him during our marriage, free from the artificial constraints that had trapped his personality for years. My own apartment in Portland had become a sanctuary where I could write, study, and process the ongoing implications of our experience. The work was challenging but meaningful in ways that my previous career had never achieved. Each victim who successfully completed recovery, each family that learned to recognize manipulation techniques, each community that implemented better safeguards felt like a victory against the forces that had stolen years of our lives. Dr. Martinez often reminded her patients that recovery from psychological manipulation was not about returning to who we had been before the conditioning began. It was about discovering who we were capable of becoming once artificial constraints were removed. For all of us, that meant building new identities from a combination of recovered authentic memories and fresh personal choices. The woman I was becoming bore some resemblance to the person I'd been before marriage, but she was stronger, more perceptive, and more committed to protecting others from the kind of victimization our family had endured. The work gave meaning to suffering that had once felt senseless and transformative. On quiet evenings in my apartment, surrounded by psychology textbooks and victim advocacy research, I sometimes wondered what our lives might have looked like if Dr. Vance had never targeted our community. Ryan and I might have remained married, struggling with the normal challenges of building a life together, rather than fighting against artificial programming designed to control our choices. But that alternate reality felt increasingly irrelevant. The people we had become through surviving this experience were more authentic, more purposeful, and more connected to meaningful work than we might have been under ordinary circumstances. The criminal conspiracy that had been designed to steal our agency had ultimately freed us to discover capabilities we'd never known we possessed. Cedar Falls continued its transformation into a community defined by recovery rather than victimization. The network of support services, educational programs, and prevention initiatives that grew from our experience became a resource for other communities facing similar challenges. What had begun as a personal quest for justice had evolved into a model for collective healing that reached far beyond our town's borders. The fight against psychological manipulation would continue long after our specific case was resolved. Dr. Martinez estimated that operations similar to Dr. Vance's network were probably active in hundreds of communities across the country, suggesting that our experience represented the beginning rather than the end of this particular struggle for justice. But we had proven that sophisticated criminal psychological operations could be exposed and defeated by ordinary people who refused to accept that their lives had been stolen. The work was dangerous, requiring courage and careful planning, but it was possible to fight back and win. As I prepared for graduate school finals and continued writing my book about our experience, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine optimism about the future. Not naive hope that ignored the continuing dangers, but realistic confidence that we had developed tools and knowledge that could protect other families from what we had endured. The divorce papers that had once seemed like the end of my marriage had actually marked the beginning of my real life. Everything that followed had been a journey toward authenticity, justice, and purpose that wouldn't have been possible under the artificial constraints Dr. Vance had tried to impose on our community. The woman who signed those divorce papers had been a victim. The woman writing this conclusion was a survivor who had transformed personal trauma into community healing. The difference represented everything Dr. Vance's psychological manipulation had been designed to prevent: the emergence of authentic personal power that could challenge and defeat institutional corruption. Our story proved that even the most sophisticated criminal operations were vulnerable to exposure by people who refused to accept that their lives belonged to anyone other than themselves. The victory belonged not just to our family, but to every victim who had found the courage to reclaim their authentic identity from those who had tried to steal it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.